Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to our Strengthening Democracy webinar. First of all, of course, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we're all coming from and pay my respects to the elders past and present and to any First Nations people who are joining us today. Please feel free to acknowledge the lands from which you're all coming from through the chat. Just firstly, a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to you on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And please use the chat function to log any of your questions. I would encourage you, though, to wait until the end of the presentations before you start doing that. And finally, this is a very comprehensive session. So if you want to read more or refresh what you've heard, you can find the reports that sit behind all of these presentations on the Scanlon Institute website. So first of all, just a brief mention about who we are. So the, I should start to move the screen. So we're coming, we are the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, and we're dedicated to social cohesion. So we do a range of research, all of which is focused on understanding better social cohesion from a number of different perspectives, but generally across the entire population. And our publications also help us to inform the national discourse and to empower communities. First of all, let me just say that trust, it's really important to remember, is a really key foundation of social cohesion. So any declines in interpersonal or institutional trust are always concerning. So we had found that decline in trust in government and the political system since COVID-19, divisions in trust in government along political, demographic and socioeconomic lines, and widely held doubts about the integrity of politicians and the electoral system. And all of this has led to a lower sense of trust in government, which negatively impacts social cohesion. Australia's democracy, though, is highly regarded around the world for its robustness, its adaptability, its functionality, and yes, its resilience, with the World Bank's governance indicators continuing to rank us in the 90th percentile. But clearly, not everybody is satisfied. So we were invited to partner with the Strengthening Democracy Task Force. It's part of the Department of Home Affairs, to look at a number of different elements that would help to strengthen democratic resilience. The first of those was to understand how we talk about democracy. The second was to understand how and when the media and politicians talk about democracy. Also to do a global search for peer-reviewed articles that evaluate programs designed to improve civic and political participation. And finally, to create a tool that anyone can use to better understand their local area, that tracks democratic resilience and informs program design. So now I'm going to hand over the session across to Trish Prentice. Trish is the Institute's senior researcher.
Thanks, Anthea. And hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. So my job was to help us to investigate community discourses about democracy. Now, I'm just going to check that my slides are flipping through. Okay, great. So in order to understand community discourses about democracy, we undertook 3 studies. The first was a general population study. So this was a national study, and we interviewed a variety of different groups and peoples in order to understand their views about democracy. So we were particularly interested in the views of younger versus older Australians, those in lower income brackets versus higher income brackets, and renters and homeowners. The second study we undertook was with a migrant group. So these were individuals who were born overseas. And we were, again, particularly interested in gathering the views of people from different countries of origins, different regions, and also from different lengths of time in Australia, so more recent arrivals versus longer-term migrants. In the final study, it was a little bit different. So we did a few qualitative interviews, but we also did a survey. And in this group, we were particularly interested in understanding the views of Chinese and Indian individuals. And the reason for that is they are our two largest and growing migrant populations. So we wanted to capture their views as well. And they obviously come from very different systems of government. So what did we find? This slide represents the results of the national study. So when we asked the question, what does democracy mean to you? Most people said participating in the process of selecting government, followed by the ability to vote, followed by representation, so the government represents me, followed by having a say, followed by freedom of expression. So this was the view that I can say my opinions, or I can give voice to my views without fear, without repercussion. And there are some lesser responses under that, as you can see, about freedom and equity and elections and so on. So as we go through, I will from time to time introduce you to some of the narratives that came up in the interview. So these are two responses to the question, what does democracy mean to you? And the first is from a 60-year-old female, and the second is from a 22-year-old male from different states. And so I think it's important that you read for yourself some of the framings of the responses as we go through. If you can't read them in the time before I switch the slide, don't worry, because these are all in the reports and the slides will be available to you later, so you can refer back to them. So understandings of democracy. When we asked the individuals in the migrant group, what does democracy mean to you? The most common response was freedom of expression. So again, this idea that I can say what I think without repercussion and without fear. And there's a framing there of a young man from Afghanistan who'd been in Australia for 2 years. In the Chinese and the Indian population study, the most common responses were either the ability to vote or freedom of expression. So again, you can see there is slightly different emphases in the different groups. In the national study, there was more an emphasis on processes and procedures, and particularly in the migrant group, there was this emphasis on rights and freedom, so slightly different weightings to their understandings. The next question we asked was, how important is it to you to live in a democracy? And as you can see from that slide, the sentiments were very positive. So most people said it was very important, or absolutely important, or extremely important. And that was the case across the groups that we asked that question. The next question we asked was, is democracy in Australia working? Now, the most positive sentiments were expressed by the migrant group. So 68% of participants felt that democracy was working in Australia. Those, however, who had been here a little bit longer tended to be a little bit more critical of the way democracy was working. In the national study, the general population study, it was about half and half. So about half of the participants felt it was working, half felt it either wasn't working, or they had some concerns or some qualifications about how it was working. And interestingly, those with the lowest sentiments, or the most negative sentiments, were those in the Indian sample, who about 18% felt that democracy was working, and a majority felt that it wasn't. So why was that the case? What were people's concerns? These are the concerns of the national study again. So when I asked them, what are you concerned about how democracy is working? What do you feel are the threats to Australia's democracy? The most frequent response was the influence of corporations on government decision-making, followed by not having a say, either in the things that are important to me, or the things that are, or the decisions that are being made about my life, followed by politicians' interests. So here it was the view that democracy should represent the views of the country, not the political class, followed by foreign influence, and followed by concerns related to media, so bias and polarization. Now, those are the raw frequencies, so the percentages from that group. But what I did after that was I clustered the responses into categories of concern, which I think give us another set of insights to understand people's concerns. So the color coding on the graph, and also in the key on the side here, represent the groupings that I constructed. So one group concerns problems with the democratic system and processes. The second relates to concerns about the public discourse and information. The third is about private interests. The fourth is about the expectations of office holders. And the fourth is the influence of the other on decision making, which I'll come back to in the next slide. So looking at these categories, the most frequent category of concern was with the democratic system or processes. And here indicative concerns were things like having insufficient say on matters of concern, matters of relevance to people's lives, the lack of differentiation between the major parties, and fragmentation in government. When it comes to inadequate public discourse, that was the second most frequent category. Unbalanced information or biased information presented in the public sphere. And this was impacting Australians' ability to make informed political choices. The third most frequent category was private interests. So again, this is that influence of large corporations or lobby groups on government decision-making. The fourth was the expectations of office holders. So here it was about the conduct of elected representatives and how that influenced people's views about democracy as an entire system or process. And finally was the influence, the final category was the influence of the other. So here people were concerned about the influence of what they called minority groups, whether that be migrants or whether that be First Nations peoples, government decision-making. And that might also be reflective of the time in which we did the interviews, because it was right after the referendum. So there was a lot of talk about the voice at that time. So again, here are some of the narratives about people's concerns. Again, different age groups, different states, different genders. So you can see in terms of people's actual words about how they express their concerns about democracy. And don't worry, again, you can read those in the report if you didn't read them all now. In terms of the migrant population group, their biggest concern about democracy was that it was not looking after the needs of migrants. So they spoke about things like feeling that they were important at election time when they were confronted by representatives who were interested in their views, but not necessarily at other times of the year. Concerns about visa processing and citizenship requirements and so on. Their second area of concern was problems again with the democratic system or processes similar to the national group. And again, expectations of office holders' conduct and private interests. Interestingly, in the survey for Indian participants and Chinese participants, their strongest area of concern about democracy was economic inequality, followed by influence of corporations, misinformation, and the influence of trade unions or radical groups. So again, you can kind of see similar categories of concerns between the groups, different weightings of concern. Some are more primary and some are more secondary, depending on which group we're focusing on. Now, there is a lot of content in the report that I won't speak to today. There is a whole section on representation. So when we talk about being represented by government, what does that mean? And we might hypothesize that if somebody votes for an individual or a party and that individual or party is elected, then that person might feel represented. But that wasn't what we found in the study. In fact, representation is a bit more complex and a bit more nuanced. And even individuals, for example, who voted for the Labor Party in the last election didn't feel represented currently, even though they're in power. So I'd encourage you to have a read through about those views about representation if you're interested. And here it was one of the clearest differences that we found between the different groups in that national study. So renters and lower income earners tended to feel less represented by government than those who are homeowners and those who are in the higher income brackets. Again, we asked questions about trust in government. Does the government tend to do the right thing? And political participation. What does participation mean? And what forms of participation are people involved in apart from voting? And you can read those responses in the report. The final slides are about media. So in any conversation about democracy, it's inevitable the question of the media's role comes up. And in the context of these interviews, I asked them questions along the lines of how did you decide who you were going to vote for in the last federal election, and where did you get political information from? And this is where the question of the media came up. So as you can see from this graph, again, this is from the national study, there is certainly a leaning more towards social media and a leaning potentially away from traditional media sources such as news on the television or radio or online or print newspapers. And the question that I then asked was, how trustworthy would you consider the traditional media? In the general population group, about 50% said they thought the media was trustworthy and about 50% thought it wasn't. And particularly that view was prevalent amongst young people. So young people tended to feel traditional media was untrustworthy or biased or swayed or affiliated with particular political views or driven by corporate interests. Interestingly, Chinese participants had the strongest sense of trust in the media. 76% said they had a good deal of trust or some trust in traditional news media in terms of reporting. And the Indian participants were similar to the general population group, about 50-50. Before I hand over to Rouven, I'll just make a quick comment about qualitative research. So by definition, qualitative research have smaller sample sizes. It's a time-intensive and resource-intensive form of research. However, what it does do is capture narratives. And in the context of democracy, narratives are really important. They are the voices of individuals, and democracy aims to certainly to capture the voices of individuals. But more importantly, narratives do influence behaviour. And if our interest is in understanding Australia's democratic resilience now and into the future, then the narratives that individuals are expressing as they think about democracy are critically important to how we understand where we are and where we want to go into the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Trish. That was terrific. So, Rouven, we'll hand it over to you now.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you all for joining. There you go. Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you all for joining. I will talk to you about two research projects that fell under the Strengthening Democracy program. I'm just making sure that I too can control the slides. So the first project was about understanding public discourses about democracy. And so while Trish spoke to members of the general population and migrant communities, what I did was look at parliamentary speeches made by politicians in either of the chambers of the federal parliament, as well as news media articles about democracy. And the strategy to find those relevant speeches and news articles was to come up with a framework of 16 democratic issues. And for each of these issues, I defined a set of words or phrases that I then used to identify speeches or news articles where those words or sets of phrases appeared. And so for parliamentary speeches, I looked at a time frame of about 17, 18 years from January 2006 to October 2023. And for news media articles, I looked at it at a period from January 2014 to November 2023. And in total, I looked at about 118,000 speeches made in Parliament and over 1 million news media articles. And okay, oh, that's one too far. And there were really two things that I wanted to show you today. And so the first one looked at what topics were discussed together, both in parliamentary speeches and in news media articles. And one of the key findings really was that these clusters of issues didn't differ all that much between news media and Parliament. And so in total, we found 5 clusters. And so you've got a table of these 5 clusters here, and each column is one cluster. And in the top row of the table, you've got the name of the cluster. And then in the rows below, you have the issues that fall under this cluster. And for most of these clusters, the interpretation is fairly straightforward. And I do have a table of what all these different topics mean, and they are in the public report if you want to have a read later. But for this presentation, I really wanted to focus on talking about the rights and freedoms cluster. So the rights and freedoms cluster is made up of 4 democratic issues. It includes rights and freedoms, which include things like the right to privacy and the right to protest, but also freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Expressions of dissatisfaction with democracy includes topics around demonstrations and protests, as well as protest voting behavior such as donkey votes. Threats to freedom of information includes issues around media concentration and bias, as well as mis- and disinformation. And threats to electoral processes includes electoral interference and voter disenfranchisement. And sort of at first glance, there's really a question of what do these topics have in common that they're clustered under the same, I guess, overarching issue. And I really want to draw attention to the fact that all of these 4 topics relate to issues around people's access to accurate, reliable, and transparent information, their ability to express their opinions, and to participate in democratic processes, both in formal ways such as voting, but also in informal ways such as protests. And there's really implications of these sort of 4 topics as they relate to people's rights and freedoms that they want to have when they live in a democracy. And it really speaks back to Trish's findings, really, and that is quite interesting because we came at this topic from such different angles with such different methodologies, that we found a concern around issues of media concentration, media bias, being able to access accurate and reliable information. When Trish spoke to members of the communities and general population, and these concerns are mirrored in the way news media and politicians talk about democracy. So there's really, I guess, a shared view here across different spheres of society that is an issue that needs to be addressed, and that is a central issue to democracy itself. The second finding that I wanted to talk to you about today is differences in which minority groups are being talked about when news media and politicians talk about democracy. And there's a total of 24 minority groups that we considered for this research, but I only picked 5 for this presentation. And so you can see those 5 groups in the rows of the table to the very left. And then each column represents one democratic issue. And I picked those democratic issues that each of these 5 groups was most mentioned in relation to in both parliamentary speeches and news media. So, for example, across all parliamentary speeches for the entire time period, First Nations people were most often mentioned in relation to election types, whereas migrants and refugees were most often mentioned in relation to democratic values. And even though I only picked the most common mentions for each group across both parliamentary speeches and news media here, you can see quite a clear trend where symbolized by the news icons in the very right column, news media predominantly talked about expressions of dissatisfaction with democracy. Over 10% of news media articles focused on that particular issue. And for 4 of the 5 minority groups that I picked for this presentation, they are most commonly mentioned in relation to expressions of dissatisfaction with democracy in news media. Now, when we compare that to the parliamentary discourses, you can see that there's a lot more variation there. For the 5 minority groups that I picked, each of them were mentioned most commonly in relation to a different issue, and there was not really much of an overlap. So that indicates that politicians, when they talk about democracy, who they talk about, which minority group they talk about, very much depends on the type of issue that they focus on in their speech. Whereas in news media articles, there's much more of a focus on how, these minority groups maybe express their dissatisfaction with democracy. Again, these are only the the findings in relation to the most common mentions. And when you look at the report, you'll find a breakdown for different minority groups for all of the democratic issues that we looked at. And you will see that there's a lot more nuance in those findings, but in terms of the key trends, that is really what I wanted you to take away from this presentation. Now to the second research project that I did for this research program. And that really was a review of published academic literature. And so it was very much a desk-based research project. And there were 3 steps to that. And the first step was to identify a wide range of potentially relevant studies from different sources. And those sources were predominantly academic databases. I found about 2,500 possibly or potentially relevant studies. And through a 2-step selection process, I whittled those down to a total of 48. So I included 48 studies in this research project, and I summarized their characteristics, such as methodology and approach, but also the information about the programs that these studies assessed. So what were the key findings? And there were really 4 key findings. 2 are really about the different approaches that have been taken to improve participation outcomes, and 2 other findings are really about what we don't actually know that well based on the literature that I looked at. And so the first finding is that there was a wide range of programs that can lead to improvements in participation outcomes. So among the 48 studies that I looked at, some of them looked at national scale health promotion interventions. Some looked at funding schemes to improve volunteer training and support. But there were also a lot smaller scale, more place-based approaches to things like leadership skill development or capacity building in particular communities. But all of those, in one way or another, aim to improve civic and political participation outcomes. So that's the first finding. The second finding was that sometimes these kind of improvements can occur as a byproduct. So as I said before, some of the programs that were assessed in the literature that I looked at were health promotion programs. Now, the focus of these kinds of programs were health outcomes, first and foremost. But what researchers found that some of these also did improve political and civic participation outcomes. So, for example, some of the health promotion interventions also improved participation in community groups. They improved they improved people's capacity to lobby their local council around certain health-related issues, for example. But these findings also need to be viewed with a bit of a caveat, in the sense that, unfortunately, I didn't really have time to assess the methodological quality of the academic studies that I looked at. So that really relates to some of these studies finding that a particular program improved participation outcomes, but maybe the fact that they did find such an improvement was really only a result of the methodology that the researchers used to assess the program. But this is a question that I couldn't actually assess. So that is the first caveat of the findings, and really more research is needed to assess the quality of the evaluations that are being conducted, so that we can be certain in the published findings and know for certain which programs actually work. But beyond that, more research is also needed on the particular program components that make any program effective and why those components work. And unfortunately, in academic literature, there's often very little detail around what the different program components are, and there's often not a view or not enough information to determine whether any program component in particular made that program successful or not. And so future research really needs to not only look at maybe published academic literature, but widen the search criteria and look at unpublished evaluations, but maybe more importantly, speak to the people who design and implement these programs, speak to the participants of these programs to really more vigorously assess why certain parts of a program work and how we can further improve these and maybe ensure that they can also be implemented in other contexts with other participants, and maybe for different types of outcomes as well. That being said, we did want to give you program considerations as well that you can use when you design your programs. And now these program considerations are based on the experience of the Scanlon Foundation in supporting these kinds of programs. And we came up with 5 considerations that we think characterize effective programs. And so the first one is that effective programs involve community and stakeholders throughout all stages, from program design through delivery to evaluation. And that is really to make sure that programs are culturally appropriate and safe, that they have the support of the community, and that they also respond to actual community needs. The second consideration is that effective programs adopt a strengths-based approach, and that they build on and amplify existing resources and strengths that a community already has. The third consideration is that effective programs build community capacity so that communities develop the skills to proactively identify and then work together to solve issues as they arise. The fourth consideration is that effective programs are evidence-based. So based on academic published literature, but also based on the expertise and knowledge of stakeholders, of practitioners, and of the community members who these programs may be targeting. And ultimately, effective programs require appropriate levels of funding, including for infrastructure, staff, and any other resources that may be needed to make the program a success. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rouven. I appreciate that. So now it's time we move into the third stage of the project, which is the Social Cohesion Compass. We created this data visualization tool to take the information that you'd receive, but to give it more context and make it very relevant in your local area. So the Social Cohesion Compass, this data visualization tool, provides you with 5 different opportunities. One is that we provide you with localized data and a detailed picture of a local government area. You can compare the Scanlon Monash Index across local government areas, but also know whether or not they're above or below the average. And then we can also compare the Democracy Index, which we've newly created, and you can also see whether any local government area is above or below the average for that. And then we've also taken the information that Rouven just shared with you and put together a set of recommendations that you can look at depending on a particular age cohort as to what the recommendations are around program design. And then finally, we've also created a set of indicators that you can look at to see whether or not there's a relationship between the political participation and income or education. So we might just move to the next slide, which just refers to some of the metrics that you probably need to know for this. So many of you will be familiar with the Scanlon Monash Index, which is created as a result of 90 questions that we ask in the Mapping Social Cohesion survey. And in 2023, there were 7,500 respondents, which is a very healthy size for putting the index together. And it's quite unique. There isn't an index or a survey of this kind anywhere else in the world. The information that we then gathered from that was to create a democracy index. So we took, in actual fact, we started with 20 questions and went down to 15 that came from those same respondents and have created for us a baseline number that we can then track over time. But essentially what you will see in the Social Cohesion Compass is just a baseline number, but we can tell you whether you're above or below the average for a local government area. Now, both of these have then been modelled down to the local government level. And this is, we've used an international model, but that is also used nationally for things like the unemployment figures and the like. So you don't necessarily have to have surveyed every local government area, but you can make estimates based on the particular profiles of that area. And then finally, there is the Social Cohesion Compass, which, as I mentioned, and you'll see, actually does look at everything at a local government area allows you to search various local government areas, program recommendations. You can compare between LGAs, and you can look at this relationship with income and education. So on the next slide, then, I just wanted to mention the 5 different cohorts that will be that we can look at. Those 5 cohorts are based on the phase of the project that Rouven just mentioned. So we've looked at adults 55 plus, female youth from 18 to 30, male youth from 18 to 30, adults 30 to 55, and young people up to the age of 18. And then we've provide you, and you'll see that on this next slide. So this is the 3 views that you have of the Social Cohesion Compass. When you go onto the Scanlon Institute website, you'll be able to search for the Social Cohesion Compass. And the first site that you'll come up with is this larger one on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll be able to see there that you can search by state and then by local government area. It will then produce for you a map of that area, provide you with some basic statistics that you might need in order to understand the context of that area. And then on the far right-hand side, you'll be able to see the measures around the Scanlon Monash Index and the Democracy Index. Then if you scroll down, when you get to onto the website and start scrolling down, you'll be able to move through to the second screen, which looks at being able to compare 2 different local government areas on the 5 domains of social cohesion that we measure in the Scanlon Monash Index, which is worth, social justice, acceptance, belonging, and participation. And you'll be able to chop and change between the LGAs that you're interested in. And then the third screen that you'll be able to see looks at political participation and its relationship to income, political participation and its relationship to education based on specific states. So these are state views. So you'll see every LGA listed in there. So you can see that on this particular visual, you'll be able to see all of the different local government areas in there. I would just mention that the different colours don't mean anything. It's just enabling you to be able to see them differently from one particular local government area to another. So you can have a look at that by state, and then also the Democracy Index as well. So that's our introduction, if you like, to the Social Cohesion Compass. And I'm sure, well, I hope you'll all find it very interesting to go and have a look at that on the website. We are interested in your feedback. So anything that you can provide us that tells us how you're using it or what you would like to see added to it would be terrific. We'd really appreciate that. But otherwise, we might move into the question and answer time. So I know there've been quite a few questions in the chat, to say the least. So I might just find some of those to ask. Trish, I suspect yours are the ones that will be coming up. And yes, the slides will be available today. The whole presentation is available on our YouTube channel for those people that are interested in looking at the presentation again. Now, let's see. There's a comment from John that says democracy is an educative process and a social ideal. Participating in democratic practices is the deepest way to teach democratic values. All people matter and all people can grow through participation in self-governance. I think we'd all agree with that. Does Scanlon know if the pattern of media being used by participants is similar to the spread across the general population? So Rouven or Trish?
Very.
Rouven?
Well, there are other surveys on this issue, but the methodology behind what Trish did was around sort of non-probability based samples, so we can't generalize her findings to the general population. But there are ways to still compare the responses to the same questions across surveys, but that always has to be, I guess, sort of done carefully and looking at the composition of the samples.
So Trish, there's another question that says, why was migrant population excluded from some questions?
Sure. There were two reasons. Both of them were pragmatic. Firstly, that research was done in conjunction with another piece of research. So we necessarily had a shorter time frame to ask the questions. And secondly, it served as a little bit of a pilot. So we did that study first and we test ran some of the questions through that group and then used them for the other studies later on.
So I think here there's a question around the methodology. I think it actually says for the quant study, but I think they actually mean the qualitative study. So Trish, could you just sort of backtrack a bit about the methodology that sat behind the work that you did?
Okay, sure. So 3 studies. The first was a qualitative study, so based on interviews. And the number of interviews is in the report. So it was a national study. We recruited through a commercial recruiter based on particular variables that we wanted to study. So age, income, and we also made sure we had a range of individuals from different genders, different political leanings and so on. So that was the first study. The migrant population study, we used a technique called snowballing. We started off with our stakeholders and then moved into migrant populations that way, with people recommending others to be interviewed. Again, there were 1-hour interviews. The questions were a subset of the questions that we came to use later on in the general population study. And the third study, which was a quantitative study, we ran those questions, we ran the survey through a panel of Indian or South Asian representatives and also Chinese, and they were done in language as well, with a few interviews to supplement the responses there.
Thanks very much, Trish. Now, Rouven, I believe this one is for you, because I know it popped up at the same time as you were looking at the 5 different minority groups, and Beck wants to know the reason for choosing those 5 minority groups or groupings. How did that come about?
So we looked at a total of 24 minority groups, and the findings are broken down for those minority groups in the public report. I picked those 5 to just illustrate the key trends across the data. So I wanted to look at different minority groups in terms of, I guess, because First Nations people, there was a really clear pattern that they weren't all that much talked about in the years before, and there was a really sort of large spike in the year of the referendum, which made that sort of quite easy to highlight as I guess a help for people to understand the report when they read it, because there's a lot more information in that report, and I really only wanted to show them how to take those figures and interpret them for themselves. So the 5 that I picked were really to indicate the clear trends across all 24 minority groups in relation to the 16 democratic issues.
Thank you very much, Rouven. There is a question here, but I don't think we can answer it, which says, do we have any data to show comparison of representation of refugee and migrant background MPs in Australian Parliament versus other democratic countries such as the UK, New Zealand, Canada, the US and EU?
I'm not aware of any such data. Future research, even sort of building on what we've already done, we could, for example, look at the background of the speakers as well, which we haven't done for this particular project, but we know when we retrieve the speeches from Hansard, we know who the MPs were who made those speeches. And so that is something that we could possibly look at, whether, how politicians talk about democracy varies by whatever sort of demographic background variables we choose. But that would be, an area for future research.
Yeah, I think everybody, it's just so attractive, isn't it, with research, that the more you get, the more you want to know. So yes, there is another question here also about wondering if you observed any difference in reviews of democracy in respect to federal and state government versus local government versus community organisations, because this person, Tim, is suggesting that they could be quite different. Rouven?
I'm wondering whether I mean, my research didn't necessarily look at different levels of government. It might be interesting though whether Trish came across any nuances there.
Yeah, certainly when we talked about what does democracy mean to me, there was certainly reference to a national processes and the national system, less some reference to state and very little to local as well. So I found that an interesting finding that when people think of democracy, they think about the federal level predominantly.
Yeah. There is a question about the data visualization tool, I think the Social Cohesion Compass, about analysis by state available. There is some state data there. There's not, it's mostly at the local government level, except for the final comparisons, which really do look at the relationship between political participation. Those give you a state view, but not necessarily the specifics to the state data. I'm just checking for other questions. Let's see. There's some interesting chats. I'm enjoying watching all of those. What's the relationship between social capital and social cohesion? Do areas with high levels of the former, as in social capital, also have high levels of social cohesion? You'd assume so. Trish, do you have a view about that? Because you've done quite a bit of research that looks at these sort of different elements and literature reviews.
Yeah, it's a contested relationship. And the reason for that is there isn't really a consensus about what social cohesion means. And therefore, some people would include social capital as an element of social cohesion, and some theorists wouldn't. And for us, we don't, although we certainly recognise the importance of social bonds, both within groups and between groups. And some of our work does highlight and focus on that, but we don't measure it and we don't map it as an institute.
Thanks very much. There is a question from John about whether or not we have recent data regarding social cohesion since October the 7th. It's a question we get asked a great deal at the moment, but no, we don't. And we are, so the Scanlon Monash, the Mapping Social Cohesion Survey will go into the field in July. So we'll be very interested to see what the results show as a result of October the 7th, but it's certainly an area of considerable interest across the board. Considering Rouven's advice that further research is needed to better understand the effectiveness of programs, it'd be wonderful if the Scanlon Foundation could develop an evaluation tool or template guide to support those designing and delivering programs and conducting research to improve quality and consistency of evaluation. Well, we'll definitely take that on board and see whether or not that's something that we can do. Okay. I think I covered the methodology. Well, the methodology for the quant study. So I'm not exactly sure. So I think I've got all of that. Question for all participants. What do you see as the next step in research, particularly for universities, to build on the work that Scanlon's been doing on social cohesion? For Rouven specifically, can you tell us more about what you'd like to see universities doing in the evaluation space in order to improve social cohesion outcomes? So Rouven, I'll let you answer that one first.
I think there's a lot of great work already being done at universities in this space. I think one of the key issues with that type of research is often that it requires a lot of resourcing and quite a lot of time. And there might be a bit of a mismatch in terms of the time that practitioners and those delivering these programs have available and the time that might be required to perform an evaluation that meets academic standards. So I think if there's one area that maybe needs a bit more attention is how can we bridge the different levels of resourcing and time to still come up with ways that we can conduct rigorous evaluations of the programs that are being run, but that are not too time and resource consuming, because often evaluation is that part of the program design and implementation that gets the least funding and resourcing. So I think if anything, more work needs to be done to come up with more time and cost efficient ways of conducting rigorous evaluation research.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that we have been also working with Welcoming Australia, who's developing and has just recently put out for feedback a welcoming standard for universities. So looking at how they can contribute overall as entire entity to building that social cohesion within the universities as well. But we would actually, as you said, Rouven, really like more evaluations and more published evaluations on programs that are actually dealing with democratic resilience and civic participation. That would be terrific. A comment from Gail that says, alarming that people get most of their information through social media, which provides great platforms for misinformation and disinformation, which is also a major concern for responders. Was there any elements of that research that was surprising to you, Trish?
Yeah, I didn't feel that alarm, but I think that is certainly one reaction. And the reason for that was because I found when talking to people and delving a little bit more deeply into their social media use, they distinguish between types of social media use. So for example, if they were talking to friends or family and connecting, they viewed those interactions as trustworthy, and they gave them a different weight to if, for example, they'd seen something flash up on Instagram about a certain newsworthy situation. So in those situations, I found that there was fact checking that was going on. So individuals didn't necessarily look at the information they were receiving and take it as it stood. They were looking to other sources to confirm or deny or to give them reassurance about what they saw. So I think in some ways that's a little bit reassuring, but certainly I think the use of social media is a growing area of research, and certainly as it's impacting democracy in our framing of democratic processes and systems, I think there's a lot of scope to explore those interactions and relationships a little bit more.
And Rouven, we did think about whether or not we could do research into the social media space. Do you want to mention some of the hurdles that one comes across when we're thinking about how do we actually gather the data?
Yeah, so when we set about designing the research project, we were hoping that we would be able to access data from, well, Twitter, now X, for example, and they did have access for researchers previously in place that ceased, I think, sometime last year, and now it's simply too expensive to access Twitter data at a large scale. And when it comes to using other social media, then there are a whole range of issues around obtaining informed consent from the people who post online, and there's a lot of issues around that, making sure that this kind of research is ethical.
And it can be very costly as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of course, most of those social media channels are very aware of how valuable their data is. So any opportunity to try to get some of it tends to be quite a costly exercise. So Raymond's also asked, migrants from different countries will have different experiences with democracy besides participating in an election. I think that expression of opinions in media will be a way to encourage development of support to democracy. Will research in looking at how migrants express their opinions in various media platforms give us some ideas on the situation in various migrant groups? Trish, what do you think?
I think that's a definite area of research that we could pursue, or that should be pursued. Yeah, I was surprised that base definition of democracy was freedom of expression, and I guess I'm not surprised at some level, certainly for individuals who have come from places where freedom of expression is not something that they can take for granted. Then having that and valuing that in the context of Australia is certainly understandable, but it's an interesting framing of democracy, perhaps. And I think that connection between the two and people's views around it, and where they would like to express themselves and how and in what context, I think there's a lot of work to understand those insights a bit more that can be done.
And Trish, can you just remind people about why it was only the Chinese and the Indian communities that we were referencing?
Just because they are the two of the largest and growing migrant populations, so we certainly wanted their voices. They also have very different experiences from their home countries of political participation. So again, it's interesting to see whether we could see any influence of that on the data.
Great, thank you. There is a question, Javed said, can we provide more details regarding the demographics and other background information of the study participants? That data is actually in the reports, so because that could go on for the next half an hour. So I might encourage people to have a look at the report. And again, the Social Cohesion Compass can be found on the Scanlon Institute website. So that's scanloninstitute.org.au. And if you have a look there, you'll be able to search for the Social Cohesion Compass and then play around with the information that's there. I would be patient if as a result of this webinar, there are quite a number of people going there. It might cause it to slow down somewhat, but hopefully if you come back maybe in an hour, it should be working just fine. Another question is an equilibrium of social cohesion healthy, or is there an appropriate level of low social cohesion to ensure social and political debate, growth as a society, and some agitation of thought on who we are? And I think it is absolutely correct that social cohesion, there is nothing wrong with it bouncing around a bit. Social cohesion, it does have the ability to take into consideration conflicts and people having debate. So yes, there isn't necessarily an appropriate level of a low social cohesion at all. There's a lot of other factors to have a look at and that underpins that. So if you do have a low level of social cohesion, then you do have to look more closely at the dynamics in that particular local government area and see whether or not that's something that you think there are elements that are out of kilter, if you like, in those particular areas. There isn't at the moment any comparison between first and second generation. What measures can be taken to mitigate polarizing ideological views? What does your research say? What can schools do to improve democratic resilience? So Trish, maybe I'll ask you first.
Well, I can say stay tuned because we will be exploring polarization in more detail later in the year. So look to our report at the end of the year and we'll certainly answer those questions.
Thanks very much, Trish. Now, I am very aware of the time and I like to be somebody that finishes on time as well as starting on time. So I do want to thank everybody for the questions that they've sent through. I'm sorry that we couldn't get necessarily to all of them. And thank you all for attending this particular event. I do appreciate that it has been an awful lot of data download, and encouraging you all to head off to read the reports is probably more than you can actually factor into your day. So I do hope that this has been something that's given you a bit of an overview of some of the work that's been done. Please do seek out the Social Cohesion Compass at your leisure. Follow us on social media, and of course, look out for our next publication. Trish, along with Andrew Marcus, has written a fabulous narrative on the suburb of Springvale here in Victoria, and this will be launched on June the 13th. And we do hope that you'll all also tune into our third series of our podcast, Voices of Australia, that'll be released in July as well. So thank you all very much for attending, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thanks so much. Bye.